You're in the rant wormhole where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get one of these by being one of those. This one's for Kuiper, who initially had wanted me to rant about who are these podcasts, but then he said to save that and instead rant about why people should back the Kickstarter for Xenon's Phantasmata, which is ending on April 2nd. So I'm going to give a shout out to this Phantasmata Kickstarter. I had a look over it. It seems to be a turn-based RPG with a very unique art style. Looking over it, it didn't really seem like something I would play, so I can't really say that I'm, all excited about it, but it also seems like the Kickstarter is nowhere even remotely close to its funding goal, and, having made a video at any point wouldn't have helped since it's going to end soon. So that's unfortunate. I'm sorry I couldn't be more of a help in this, but, there's the shout-out. I'll put a link in the description. And otherwise, let's talk about who are these podcasts, WATP. Who likes these podcasts, not WATP? I've been listening to a shitload of this show, Who Are These Podcasts? I found out about them because the host, Carl, has been a guest on The Dick Show a couple of times. He's somebody who found out about The Dick Show through doing this podcast. So what this show is a show that reviews podcasts. A podcast that reviews podcasts, mostly bad ones. Mostly to make fun of them. And it's pretty fun. How enjoyable an episode is can sometimes depend on how funny the podcast they're talking about is. Like how if it's funny bad or just bad, because sometimes, it can be hard to listen to the clips that they take from these shows. So the general conceit is that Carl and a guest, whoever he has on hand, usually just one of his friends, will both listen to an episode of this podcast before they talk about it. They haven't said anything to each other, and then they review it on the show. And each of them will pull a bunch of clips from the show that they think exemplify what is so bad about it, or just really funny moments. And they'll basically just go through and talk about it in general, play each clip, and have a laugh and make fun of it. I won't say that they're particularly all that. They're not comedians necessarily. It's mostly just ragging on the show and being like, why would you do this? But it's pretty. I think they make good clip choices. I think they make a pretty good case for why these shows are terrible or what's wrong with them. And for me as a podcast host, it's, it can be kind of enlightening, or at least a bit of a check to, say, hey, do I make these mistakes? Absolutely, with some of them, if they reviewed the Procrastinators podcast, they would probably think it was the worst fucking thing ever, because, it has so many of the things they complain about: constant talking over each other, lack of real editing or oversight, constant in-jokes, basically being incomprehensible to anybody who hasn't been listening for years and knows who all the hosts are. So, but anyway, I really love listening to them rag on other shows, especially when some of those people who they rag on will later come on to the show if they think it's funny and if they like participating. Sometimes Carl will, become friends with other podcasts, which gets you into this meta element. And this is where the real appeal of the podcast comes through for me as somebody who's mostly interested in meta in general. Is that, so Carl is a huge fan of old school terrestrial radio and XM radio, and he comes from Rochester, which of course I lived in for a year. My fiance's from there, so it's really interesting hearing him name drop all this stuff that she recognizes and knows about. He's in a band called the Isotopes, who is a known local band of Rochester, who my fiance had actually even heard of, So, he has some connections to, the recording industry and to people who do, popular podcasts from Rochester and the comedy scene there as well. So, he has a lot of interesting insights into that, and one of the big things that he talks about is the Opie and Anthony Show, which was a shock jock radio show from the 90s, so sort of similar to Howard Stern. He's also a big fan of Howard Stern, but the Opie and Anthony Show was two guys from Rochester who, eventually reached sort of nationwide syndication, and they had a big thing where each of them got kicked from XM radio. They went on to make their own shows. Opie is kind of a madman, And he has his own podcast that is possibly one of the worst podcasts ever conceived, and it's definitely fascinatingly bad. It's like bad in only, it's like the room of podcasts kind of thing, you know? So what Carl eventually did was, after he reviewed the after he reviewed Opie's show, which eventually got him invited onto Anthony's show, which is a pretty major show, and that's where a lot of his audiences come from. He now, at the end of every episode almost, will review the latest episode of Opie's show. So you have this ongoing narrative of him, like, tracking the career of Opie and listening to this awful podcast that he does just to pull clips from it and make fun of it. And it's really interesting because there's, you know, just by doing this, he's gotten himself tangled into the narrative of these people. You know, he's now, like, a part of the Opie and Anthony universe, in a way. Anthony, I mean to say. And, like, you know, he can also provide more insight into certain things because of the fact that, you know, the Opie's show has, for instance, his guest, who's always on, called Carl Ruiz, who's, like, a famous guy from Rochester. So, like, you know, he has certain things he can talk about with these podcasts that make it even more interesting. And he has a vast knowledge of radio. He's clearly, like, a big long-time radio geek, you know. So that makes it a lot of fun. And then also he's connected into the Dick Masterson universe now, because they had reviewed the Dick show and shit on it, but, like, he kind of liked it. His co-host didn't like it at all. But he ends up listening to the whole Dick show and the whole Biggest Problem, getting involved in that narrative, and now he also kind of has Maddox as another guy who he occasionally will, like, return to and talk about more. You know, he has Dick on his show sometimes. That's always a ton of fun. So that was kind of where I started, was listening to the episodes that had Dick as a guest, and then, like, working my way out from there. Now, the thing about Who Are These Podcasts is it's got 147 episodes, and the format has evolved greatly over time. Where originally it was Carl and this guy Kevin, who was really more of the main host. But Kevin's more of a little bit more down-to-earth, not as much of, like, you know, out for blood in the way that Carl is. And so the earlier episodes are a lot more tame, and they're also a lot shorter. As the show has gone on and Carl took over, like, there's just been, it's a lot more colorful. The episodes tend to be longer. There's a bigger variety of guests, and now he's kind of adapted more format stuff into it, where now you've got the Opie segments at the end of each episode. There's usually a voicemail segment after the credits and stuff. And I like that, because I like my podcasts nice and long and meaty, because I'm just going to sit there and listen to it all day anyways, and I enjoy the meta stuff almost even more than the actual episode reviews. So, yeah, and there's even more meta developing as time goes on, and they keep checking. There's certain shows that they'll kind of return to and check in on. It's a lot of fun. You know, it's not the best podcast in the world. I would say it's just, like, kind of mildly entertaining background noise, but as somebody who doesn't listen to a whole lot of podcasts, it's nice to have another one, so I'm not just listening to the Dick Show or reruns of Biggest Problem over and over again. So yeah, I recommend it. I enjoy it. I love all the drops, because he uses a lot. He has a soundboard with a fuckload of drops on it, and he'll reuse them a lot, so you start to learn them and get them in your head. My favorite one is probably, "Who gives a shit, who gives a fuck?" I say it all the time now. Or what was the one with the one girl where she's like, "Think about it, who would listen to this?" That's a good one. Anyway, yeah, check it out, and also check out that Kickstarter if you like RPGs with weird aesthetics and you want to try to get it towards its probably hopeless goal before the time is up. See you in the next one.